Sarah, 26, thought she was walking into her dream wedding morning. Instead, she found a note that would destroy her life. The wedding's canceled. You'll hear from our attorney. Her own parents had vanished, leaving behind 200 confused guests and a lawsuit claiming she stole $50,000 from them. But here's what nobody saw coming. While Sarah stayed silent as her community turned against her, she was actually playing the longest game of revenge in family court history. Because sometimes the daughter you try to frame grows up to be smarter than you ever imagined. What her parents didn't know was that their perfect victim had been documenting their lies for months. And when that courtroom door finally opened, they walked straight into a trap that would expose not just their fraud, but a criminal conspiracy that reached deeper than anyone expected. This is how I destroyed my parents' lives, by simply telling the truth. This isn't just about a home, it's about what happens when it stops feeling like one. If you haven't subscribed yet, join us now for more stories like this. The white dress hung perfectly pressed in my childhood bedroom, just like I'd dreamed since I was 7 years old. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, and I could hear birds chirping outside. It was supposed to be the most beautiful day of my life. Instead, it became the day my parents tried to destroy me. I was brushing my teeth when I heard Jake's voice from downstairs, confused and worried. "Sarah, your mom and dad aren't answering their phones. The florist is here and nobody's telling her where to put the arrangements." My heart skipped, but I wasn't worried yet. Mom had always been scattered during big events, and Dad probably went for his usual morning jog. Walking downstairs in my robe, I found our house eerily quiet. Jake stood in the kitchen holding his phone, looking lost. The counters were bare, no coffee brewing, no breakfast preparations, nothing that resembled the chaotic morning energy my mom had been planning for months. "Maybe they went to pick up the cake?" I suggested, but even as I said it, something felt wrong. That's when I saw the envelope on the dining room table. My name was written across it in my mother's perfect cursive handwriting. The paper felt heavy in my hands, expensive stationery that Mom saved for important occasions. I tore it open, expecting last-minute wedding instructions or maybe a sentimental note about how proud they were. Instead, I found a single typed sentence that made my blood freeze. "The wedding's canceled. You'll hear from our attorney." I read it 3 times before the words made sense. Jake took the note from my trembling hands, his face going pale as he processed what we were looking at. "This has to be some kind of joke," he whispered. But we both knew my parents weren't the pranking type. They were the type to plan every detail months in advance, the type to never miss a family obligation, the type to call if they were going to be 5 minutes late for dinner. My phone started buzzing, text after text from confused relatives asking where my parents were. The wedding coordinator called frantically. Vendors were arriving at the venue with no one to direct them. The pastor wanted to confirm timing. Our photographer was wondering if we needed to adjust the schedule. 200 people were expecting a celebration, and I was standing in my childhood kitchen in a bathrobe, holding a note that felt like a death sentence. Jake immediately started calling everyone, my aunts, my cousins, family friends who might know where my parents had gone. Each conversation was the same: confusion, concern, and slowly dawning horror as people realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. My parents had genuinely abandoned their daughter's wedding day. The worst call came from my maid of honor, Jessica. She was already at the venue, trying to manage the chaos of vendors and early arriving guests. "Sarah, people are starting to ask questions. Mrs. Henderson just asked me if something happened to your parents. What do I tell everyone?" I stared at that note, feeling something shift inside me. In that moment, standing in my empty house with my wedding dress hanging upstairs and my entire future crumbling around me, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to publicly defend myself or make excuses for them. "Tell everyone there's been a family emergency," I said calmly. "Tell them the wedding is postponed indefinitely, and we'll be in touch soon." I hung up the phone and looked at Jake, who was watching me with a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew that tone in my voice. It was the same tone I used when someone underestimated me, when someone thought they could manipulate or control me. My parents had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They thought they were dealing with their little girl. They had no idea they were about to face the woman they'd raised me to become. 3 days after my canceled wedding, I was still fielding sympathy calls and deflecting questions when the doorbell rang. Jake answered it while I sat at my laptop, trying to figure out how to return wedding gifts without dying of embarrassment. A man in an expensive suit stood on our doorstep holding a manila envelope that looked official and ominous. "Sarah Mitchell?" he asked, though he was clearly looking at Jake. "I have legal documents that require your signature." My stomach dropped as I walked to the door. This was it. Whatever my parents had planned, it was starting now. I signed for the envelope with hands that barely shook, proud of how calm I appeared even as my world tilted sideways. The moment the process server left, Jake and I tore open the envelope. What we found inside was worse than anything I could have imagined. My parents weren't just suing me. They were accusing me of stealing $50,000 from their joint account to pay for my wedding. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the message was crystal clear. They claimed I had forged documents, accessed their accounts without permission, and committed financial fraud. I read the complaint 3 times before the full scope of their betrayal sank in. They weren't just trying to humiliate me by canceling my wedding. They were trying to destroy my entire future. A fraud conviction would mean criminal charges, possible jail time, and a permanent record that would follow me for the rest of my life. They were weaponizing the legal system to punish me for something, and I still had no idea what I'd done wrong. Jake was pacing around our small living room, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "This is insane, Sarah. You never touched their money. We saved for 2 years to pay for this wedding ourselves. We have the bank statements to prove it." But even as he said it, I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. Not doubt about my innocence, but doubt about whether we could prove it. The lawsuit detailed specific dates and amounts that allegedly showed my pattern of theft. According to my parents, I had systematically drained their savings account over 6 months, using their money to pay vendors while pretending my own savings were funding the wedding. They had bank records, they claimed, and witness statements from people who had seen me acting secretively about wedding finances. Reading their version of events was like looking into a funhouse mirror. Every normal interaction we'd had about wedding planning was twisted into evidence of my supposed deception. When I'd asked Mom to call the caterer to confirm menu details, they claimed I was trying to hide payment information. When Dad had offered to drive me to vendor appointments, they said I was preventing him from seeing the bills. They had taken months of normal family support and turned it into a criminal conspiracy. The most devastating part wasn't the legal accusations. It was the personal statement my mother had written. She described me as a manipulative daughter who had always been jealous of their financial stability, someone who felt entitled to their money and willing to steal it when they refused to fund my extravagant wedding demands. She painted a picture of a spoiled, greedy young woman who would destroy her own family for a party. Jake found me crying over that statement, and for the first time since finding their note, I let myself break down completely. "They really hate me," I sobbed into his shoulder. "I don't even know what I did wrong, but they actually hate me enough to try to put me in prison." He held me while I cried, but I could feel his anger radiating through his silence. That night, lying in bed, unable to sleep, I made my second crucial decision. I wasn't going to let them rewrite history. Everyone expected me to fight back immediately. My friends wanted me to post on social media, explaining my side of the story. Jake's family offered to hire the most aggressive attorney they could find. Even my few remaining relatives, who hadn't completely written me off, suggested I should clear the air publicly before the rumors got worse. But I had learned something important about my parents over the years. They thrived on drama and attention. They wanted me to react emotionally, to make mistakes they could use against me later. So instead, I disappeared. Not literally, but socially. I stopped answering calls from anyone except Jake and my lawyer. I deactivated my social media accounts. I turned down every interview request from local reporters who had somehow caught wind of the story. When people saw me at the grocery store or the bank, I was polite but distant, giving them nothing to gossip about later. My silence became its own kind of statement, and I could see it frustrated people who were hungry for details. The hardest part was watching my parents control the narrative while I stayed quiet. Through mutual friends and extended family, I heard how they were spinning the story. According to them, I had become increasingly demanding and entitled in the months leading up to the wedding. They claimed I had threatened to cut them out of my life if they didn't pay for the celebration I wanted. When they tried to have a reasonable conversation about budget constraints, I had apparently screamed at them and stormed out, then retaliated by stealing their money. Their version sounded believable because it contained just enough truth to feel real. I had been stressed about wedding planning. We had disagreed about certain expenses. There had been tense conversations about guest lists and vendor choices, but they took those normal family conflicts and weaponized them, turning every moment of wedding stress into evidence of my supposed criminal mindset. Jake struggled with my decision to stay silent more than I did. He watched his own family start to whisper about me at Sunday dinners, saw his co-workers become uncomfortable when my name came up, felt the weight of defending someone who wouldn't defend herself. "Sarah, people are starting to believe them," he said one evening after a particularly awkward encounter with his boss. "Your silence is making you look guilty." But I was using my silence strategically. While everyone else was focused on the drama, I was working with my attorney to build our defense. We requested financial records, gathered documentation of my own savings and spending, and started the painstaking process of proving my innocence. More importantly, I was studying my parents' behavior patterns and starting to ask uncomfortable questions about their own finances. The breakthrough came when I was organizing old family photos and found a folder of documents my parents had left behind in their hasty exit. Mixed in with insurance papers and old tax returns, I discovered something that made my blood run cold: credit card statements showing massive debt I'd never known about. Not just normal credit card debt, but the kind of desperate, minimum payment-only debt that suggested serious financial trouble. I spent 3 sleepless nights going through every document, cross-referencing dates and amounts. What I found painted a picture of a family whose financial stability had been an elaborate illusion for years. The perfect middle-class lifestyle my parents had maintained was built on a foundation of credit card debt, personal loans, and increasingly desperate attempts to keep up appearances. Suddenly, their decision to cancel my wedding and sue me for theft made horrible sense. They weren't just trying to punish me. They were trying to solve their own financial crisis by making me the villain. If they could prove I had stolen from them, they could potentially recover money they didn't actually have, while simultaneously explaining away their own upcoming financial collapse. I finally understood what I was really fighting. This wasn't about wedding planning or family drama. This was about survival, and my parents had decided I was expendable. Armed with the shocking evidence I'd found in my parents' abandoned documents, I became a detective in my own family's financial history. What started as a desperate search for proof of my innocence turned into an investigation that revealed decades of lies, manipulation, and financial deception that went far deeper than I could have imagined. My attorney, David Chen, was initially skeptical when I brought him the credit card statements and loan documents. "Sarah, even if your parents have debt problems, that doesn't prove you didn't take their money," he warned. But as we dug deeper, requesting bank records and financial statements through legal discovery, a pattern emerged that was far more sinister than simple overspending. The first major discovery came when we accessed my college fund account, an account I hadn't checked since graduating 4 years ago because I assumed it was empty. I had been told throughout high school that the fund would cover my tuition and expenses, and when I received financial aid for college, my parents explained that the fund money was being saved for graduate school. What we found instead was a systematic pattern of withdrawals that had been occurring for over a decade. My parents had been using my college fund as their personal emergency account since I was 15 years old. Every time they faced a financial crisis, and there had been many, they dipped into money that was legally supposed to be mine. Car repairs, home improvements, credit card payments, even vacation expenses had been funded with money my grandparents had specifically designated for my education. But the college fund was just the beginning. David's investigation revealed that my parents had been engaging in what he called financial musical chairs for years. They would open new credit cards to pay off old ones, take cash advances to make minimum payments, and use balance transfers to create the illusion that they were managing their debt. They had become experts at manipulating their credit scores just enough to keep getting approved for new accounts. The most devastating discovery came when we found records showing they had forged my signature on several financial documents over the years. When I was 18 and away at college, they had opened a credit card in my name and used it to pay for home repairs. When I was 22 and focused on starting my career, they had taken out a personal loan using me as a co-signer without my knowledge. Each time, they had made just enough payments to keep the accounts current, so I never received calls from creditors or noticed the impact on my credit report. I remember the day David called me with the worst news yet. "Sarah, sit down," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "We found evidence that your parents have been stealing from you for at least 8 years. The total amount we can document so far is over $75,000. I sat in my car outside the grocery store, trying to process the fact that my own parents had been systematically robbing me since I was a teenager. The irony was crushing. They were suing me for stealing $50,000 while they had actually stolen more than that from me over the course of nearly a decade. Every time I had wondered how they could afford their lifestyle on Dad's teacher salary and Mom's part-time administrative job. Every time I had admired their financial stability and wished I could be as responsible with money as they seemed to be, they had been funding their lives with money that belonged to me. Jake found me that night sitting at our kitchen table, surrounded by financial documents and legal papers, crying angry tears over everything I'd lost. Not just the money, though that was devastating enough. I had lost my trust in the people who were supposed to protect me. I had lost my sense of family, my childhood home, and my belief in the fundamental goodness of the people who raised me. But most importantly, I had found the ammunition I needed to destroy them completely. While I maintained my strategic silence, my parents launched a full-scale social media war against me. It started subtly at first, my mother posting cryptic messages about betrayal from those closest to you, and learning hard truths about people you thought you knew. But within 2 weeks, their campaign became a coordinated attack designed to destroy my reputation in our small community. My dad, who had barely used Facebook before this, suddenly became prolific at posting what he called educational content about financial elder abuse. He shared articles about adult children who steal from their parents, always with captions like, "This hits close to home," and "You never think it could happen to your own family." The comments from family friends were devastating. Dozens of people expressing shock and support, promising to keep my parents in their prayers during this difficult time. The worst part was watching how expertly they manipulated the narrative. My mother posted a throwback photo of me at my high school graduation with a caption that read, "So proud of our girl that day. If only we had known then what we know now about the choices she would make." The post got over 200 likes and 50 comments, each one from someone expressing sympathy for her heartbreak and disappointment in me. They were careful never to directly accuse me of anything specific in their posts. David had warned them about potential defamation issues. Instead, they used emotional manipulation and implied accusations that were somehow more damaging than direct statements would have been. When people asked for details in the comments, Mom would respond with things like, "We're trying to handle this privately, but sometimes you have to protect yourself," or "The legal system will sort out the truth." The community rallying around my parents was the hardest part to watch. These were people who had known me since I was a child, who had watched me grow up, graduate valedictorian from high school, and build a successful career. But they believed my parents' version of events without question because my silence looked like guilt, and my parents had always been skilled at presenting themselves as victims. Jake's mother called him crying after seeing some of the posts. "People at the grocery store are asking me questions about Sarah," she sobbed. "Mrs. Patterson from church told me she always thought Sarah seemed too focused on money and material things. I defended her, but Jake, people are really starting to believe your in-laws are the victims here." The breaking point came when my parents posted what they called a timeline of red flags. A series of photos and captions that reframed every normal interaction we'd had over the past 2 years as evidence of my supposed criminal behavior. A photo of me looking at wedding venues became Sarah insisting on places we couldn't afford. A picture of me hugging Dad at Christmas became before we discovered the truth about her financial manipulation. They had weaponized our family memories, turning every moment of love and connection into ammunition against me. I watched strangers commenting on these posts, calling me ungrateful and selfish, speculating about what kind of person steals from their own parents. The Sarah they were describing in these posts wasn't me. It was a fiction they had created to justify their own actions. But their social media campaign had an unintended consequence. The more they posted, the more evidence they created of their coordinated effort to destroy my reputation. David was quietly screenshotting every post, every comment, every share. "They're building our defamation case for us," he told me with grim satisfaction. "Keep staying quiet, Sarah. Let them keep talking." The most revealing moment came when my cousin Jessica, who had been my maid of honor, finally called me after 3 weeks of silence. "Sarah, I need to ask you directly," she said, her voice strained. "Did you really steal from Aunt Linda and Uncle Mike? Because the things they're posting, it's getting really hard to defend you when you won't even defend yourself." I wanted to tell her everything right then. I wanted to explain about the college fund, the forged signatures, the decades of lies. But I had committed to my strategy, and I knew that breaking my silence too early could ruin everything we were building. "Jessica," I said quietly, "when this is all over, you'll understand why I couldn't talk, but I need you to trust me just a little bit longer." While my parents were busy destroying my reputation online, I was building the case that would destroy their lives. David had connected me with a forensic accountant named Rebecca Torres, who specialized in financial fraud investigations. Together, we began the methodical process of documenting every lie, every theft, every manipulation my parents had perpetrated over the years. Rebecca was relentless in her investigation. She obtained records from banks I didn't even know my parents used, traced money transfers that went back over a decade, and discovered financial accounts that had been hidden from me my entire life. What she found was a web of deception so complex that even I, their primary victim, was shocked by the scope of their criminal behavior. The first major breakthrough came when Rebecca discovered that my parents had been claiming me as a dependent on their taxes for 2 years after I had moved out and was financially independent. They had used my dependency status to claim tax credits they weren't entitled to, essentially stealing from both me and the federal government simultaneously. The amount was relatively small, around $3,000, but it established a pattern of using me for financial gain without my knowledge or consent. More damaging was Rebecca's discovery of what she called their credit repair scheme. My parents had been systematically opening accounts in my name, making minimum payments for 6 months to establish a payment history, then transferring the debt to new accounts while closing the old ones. This had the effect of artificially inflating their available credit while hiding the true extent of their debt from creditors. It was sophisticated financial manipulation that required detailed planning and complete disregard for my financial future. The smoking gun came when Rebecca accessed records from my parents' mortgage company. 3 years ago, when I was 23 and completely unaware, they had refinanced their home and forged my signature on documents that made me legally responsible for their mortgage debt. If they defaulted on their payments, the mortgage company could come after me for the full amount. I had been living for 3 years as an unknowing co-signer on a $200,000 loan. David was furious when Rebecca presented her findings. "Sarah, this isn't just theft," he said, spreading the documents across his conference table. "This is identity fraud, tax evasion, mortgage fraud, and conspiracy. Your parents aren't just facing a civil lawsuit anymore. This is criminal behavior that could result in federal charges." But Rebecca's investigation revealed something even more sinister. My parents' financial problems weren't recent. They had been living beyond their means for over 15 years. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle I had grown up admiring was entirely funded by debt, fraud, and money stolen from me. Every family vacation, every home improvement, every luxury purchase had been made possible by my college fund or my stolen credit. The most heartbreaking discovery was a life insurance policy my grandparents had taken out for me when I was born. The policy was supposed to mature when I turned 25, providing me with a substantial nest egg to start my adult life. My parents had cashed it out 2 years earlier, using the money to pay off credit card debt and fund what they had told everyone was a surprise anniversary cruise. I had never even known the policy existed. As Rebecca compiled her evidence, a clear picture emerged of two people who had spent decades using their own daughter as a financial resource to fund their lifestyle. They had stolen from me systematically, consistently, and without remorse. Every time I had struggled to pay for college expenses, every time I had worked extra shifts to save money, every time I had admired their financial stability and wished I could be more like them, they had been thriving on money they had stolen from my future. Jake found me crying over Rebecca's final report, which totaled their theft at over $90,000, spanning 8 years. "Sarah," he said softly, "you know what this means, right? You're not just going to win this lawsuit, you're going to destroy them completely." I looked at the evidence spread across our dining room table and felt something shift inside me. My parents had thought they were dealing with a naive young woman who would be too devastated to fight back effectively. They had no idea they had just handed me everything I needed to send them to prison. The truth about why my parents had really canceled my wedding came from an unexpected source. Jake's uncle Robert, who worked in commercial real estate and had been helping coordinate vendor payments for our reception venue. 3 weeks after Rebecca finished her financial investigation, Robert called Jake with information that completed the puzzle of my parents' motivation. "Jake, I need to tell you something, and Sarah isn't going to like it," Robert said during what I thought was a casual family dinner. "I've been keeping quiet because I didn't want to interfere. But after seeing what Sarah's parents have put you two through, I can't stay silent anymore." He pulled out his phone and showed us a text conversation that made my blood boil. 6 weeks before our wedding, my mother had contacted Robert privately, asking him to approach Jake's parents about contributing more significantly to the wedding expenses. She had told Robert that while she and my father were happy to pay for the reception, they felt Jake's family should cover the honeymoon, the photography, and what she called additional enhancements to make the wedding more appropriate for a family of Jake's social standing. Robert had been confused by the request because Jake's parents had already been incredibly generous, paying for our flowers, music, and rehearsal dinner without being asked. When he politely explained to my mother that Jake's parents felt they had already contributed appropriately, her response revealed the ugly truth behind everything that followed. "She completely lost it," Robert told us, scrolling through the increasingly frantic messages. "She started talking about how your family clearly had more money than hers, and how she was embarrassed that people would judge her for not being able to afford a wedding that matched your family's expectations. She said she would rather cancel the whole thing than be humiliated by having a budget wedding when everyone knew Jake came from money." The messages got worse. My mother had demanded that Jake's parents pay for upgraded catering, a more expensive photographer, and luxury transportation for the wedding party. When Robert explained that these weren't reasonable requests and that Jake's family was already being very generous, my mother had made threats that chilled me to the bone. "If Jake's family doesn't step up, then maybe Sarah needs to reconsider whether she's marrying into the right family." One message read, "A wedding is a reflection of both families, and I won't be embarrassed by looking cheap in comparison." The final message in the thread, sent just 2 days before my parents disappeared, was the smoking gun that explained everything. "We've decided to cancel the wedding rather than be humiliated. Don't worry about Sarah. We have a plan to make sure she understands that her loyalty should be to her family, not to people who think they're too good to properly support her special day." I stared at Robert's phone in stunned silence. My parents hadn't canceled my wedding because I had done something wrong. They hadn't even canceled it because of their financial problems, though those were certainly a factor. They had canceled my wedding because their pride was hurt that Jake's family wouldn't fund their vision of a more expensive celebration. Jake was furious in a way I had never seen before. So they destroyed Sarah's reputation, sued her for theft, and tried to break up our relationship because my parents wouldn't pay for wedding upgrades that nobody even asked for, he said, his voice shaking with rage. They turned Sarah into a criminal because they were embarrassed about money. But the most devastating part was yet to come. Robert showed us one final message, sent to him the morning my parents disappeared. "By the time this is over, Sarah will realize that her real family is the one that's always been there for her, not the one that abandoned her when she needed financial support. Sometimes you have to hurt someone to save them from making a bigger mistake. My parents hadn't just stolen my money and canceled my wedding. They had convinced themselves they were rescuing me from a relationship with people who didn't value me enough to pay for the wedding they wanted. In their twisted logic, destroying my life was an act of love designed to bring me back to them, grateful and dependent. Sitting in Robert's living room, surrounded by evidence of my parents' manipulation and lies, I finally understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just about money or weddings or family drama. This was about control, manipulation, and two people who would rather destroy their daughter's life than admit they couldn't afford the lifestyle they'd been pretending to live. They had made their choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. 2 days after Robert's revelation about my parents' real motivations, I received a phone call that would change everything. The caller ID showed an unknown local number, and when I answered, a woman's voice I didn't recognize asked if I was Sarah Mitchell. When I confirmed, she said words that made my heart race. "I have information about your parents that you need to hear. Can we meet?" The woman identified herself only as someone who's been watching this situation unfold, and insisted we meet in person rather than discuss details over the phone. Despite David's warnings about meeting strangers, my curiosity won out. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop across town, somewhere I was unlikely to run into anyone who knew my family. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her early 30s, with nervous energy and eyes that kept darting toward the windows as if she was afraid of being seen. "My name is Amanda," she said, as we sat in a corner booth far from other customers. "I work at Pine Valley Credit Union, where your parents bank. I probably shouldn't be here, but I can't stand watching what they're doing to you when I know the truth about their finances." Amanda explained that she had been my parents' loan officer for 3 years, helping them navigate an increasingly desperate series of financial crises. What she told me made my stomach drop. My parents' problems were far worse than even Rebecca had discovered. They weren't just living beyond their means, they were on the verge of complete financial collapse. "Your father has a gambling problem," Amanda said quietly, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "Not just casual betting, serious addiction that's been going on for years. He's been taking cash advances on credit cards to fund trips to the casino, then using balance transfers and new loans to hide the extent of his losses from your mother." The documents in Amanda's envelope painted a horrifying picture. Bank statements showed regular cash withdrawals of $500 to $2,000, always on weekends, always from ATMs near the local casino. Credit card statements revealed a pattern of cash advances followed immediately by minimum payments, creating a cycle of debt that had been spiraling out of control for over 2 years. But the gambling was only part of the problem. Amanda had discovered that my mother had been running her own financial scam, using her position as a volunteer treasurer for several community organizations to borrow money from their accounts. She would take funds for personal use, then replace them before audits using money stolen from other organizations, creating a shell game that was becoming impossible to maintain. "The wedding cancellation wasn't about pride or family dynamics," Amanda explained. "Your parents are facing bankruptcy within 6 months. Your father owes over $40,000 to the casino in unpaid markers, and your mother has taken nearly $20,000 from community groups. They're desperate, and framing you for theft was their attempt to generate enough money through a lawsuit settlement to pay off their most pressing debts." The most devastating revelation came last. Amanda showed me records proving that my parents had already spent the $50,000 they were claiming I had stolen from them. The money had never existed in their account. They had fabricated the entire theft story and created false documentation to support their lawsuit. They weren't trying to recover stolen money. They were trying to extort money that never belonged to them in the first place. Amanda's hands shook as she passed me the final document. "This is a copy of a promissory note your father signed at the casino 2 weeks ago. If he doesn't pay his gambling debts by the end of this month, the people he owes money to aren't the type to go through legal channels for collection. Your parents aren't just facing financial ruin, they're in physical danger." I sat in that coffee shop booth, staring at evidence that my parents were not just thieves and liars, but desperate criminals who had dragged our entire family into their web of deception. The lawsuit against me wasn't about money or pride, it was about survival. They were willing to destroy their own daughter's life to save themselves from the consequences of their own choices. Amanda stood to leave but turned back with one final warning. Sarah, be careful. When people are this desperate, there's no telling what they'll do next. Your parents have already shown they're willing to commit fraud and destroy relationships to get what they need. Don't underestimate how far they might go. Armed with Amanda's explosive evidence and Rebecca's forensic findings, David filed what he called the nuclear option, a comprehensive counter-lawsuit that would not only clear my name but expose my parents' criminal conspiracy to the world. The 40-page document we submitted to the court read like a crime thriller, detailing years of fraud, theft, and manipulation that went far beyond anything I had originally imagined. Our counter-lawsuit demanded not just the dismissal of my parents' fabricated theft charges, but financial restitution for the money they had stolen from me, damages for defamation and emotional distress, and most importantly, a full criminal investigation into their fraudulent activities. David had structured the case so that my parents would face not just civil liability, but potential federal charges for mail fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The day we filed our response, I felt a mixture of terror and relief. For months, I had been living under the shadow of their accusations, watching my reputation crumble while they presented themselves as victims. Now finally, I was fighting back with weapons they had never expected me to possess. The quiet, devastated daughter they thought they were manipulating had become their worst nightmare. My parents' attorney, a small-town lawyer named Frank Morrison who specialized in family disputes, was clearly unprepared for the scope of our counterattack. Within 48 hours of our filing, he was calling David repeatedly, trying to negotiate a settlement that would make the whole situation go away quietly. But David and I had already agreed there would be no quiet resolution. My parents had chosen to make this public when they launched their social media campaign, and now they would face the public consequences. The first crack in their facade appeared when Frank Morrison withdrew as their counsel, citing irreconcilable differences with his clients about case strategy. In legal terms, this usually means the lawyer discovered his clients had been lying to him and didn't want to risk his professional reputation by continuing to represent them. My parents were suddenly scrambling to find new legal representation while facing a lawsuit that detailed their criminal activities in devastating specificity. The local newspaper picked up the story after our court filing became public record. The headline read, "Local couple accused of elaborate financial fraud scheme against own daughter." The article, while legally careful to present both sides, included enough details from our filing to make readers understand that this wasn't a simple family dispute about wedding expenses. This was a story about parents who had systematically destroyed their daughter's financial future to fund their own lifestyle and addictions. Jake's family, who had been quietly supportive but understandably confused by the situation, finally understood what we had been dealing with. His mother called me crying, apologizing for any doubt she had harbored about my innocence. "Sarah, I can't believe your own parents would do this to you," she sobbed. "How do you even begin to process something like this?" The answer was that I wasn't processing it. I was channeling all my grief and rage into ensuring my parents faced consequences for what they had done. Every day brought new evidence of their deception. Rebecca discovered additional accounts they had opened in my name, more instances of forged signatures, and a paper trail that showed their financial manipulation went back even further than we had originally thought. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a panicked voicemail from my mother, the first direct contact I'd had with either parent since finding their note. Her voice was shaking as she begged me to stop this madness and meet with them to work things out as a family. She claimed they loved me and never intended for things to go this far, but she made no admission of guilt and offered no apology for the devastation they had caused. I saved the voicemail and forwarded it to David, who added it to our evidence file. Even in their desperation, my parents couldn't bring themselves to take responsibility for their actions. They still believed they could manipulate me into backing down, still thought their parental authority gave them the right to escape consequences for their crimes. They had never been more wrong about anything in their lives. The morning of our court hearing, I woke up feeling strangely calm. After months of sleepless nights and constant anxiety, I finally felt ready to face my parents in a courtroom and watch their lies crumble under the weight of evidence we had gathered. Jake squeezed my hand as we walked up the courthouse steps, past a small crowd of reporters who had been following the case since our counter-lawsuit became public. My parents arrived separately, looking older and more haggard than I remembered. They had hired a new attorney, Patricia Walsh, who had a reputation for aggressive defense strategies in financial crime cases. As they took their seats across the courtroom from us, my mother tried to make eye contact, her expression a mixture of desperation and what looked like genuine surprise that I was actually going through with this. Judge Martinez, a stern woman with a no-nonsense reputation, called the proceedings to order and immediately made it clear she had read both filings thoroughly. "This case involves serious allegations on both sides," she said, looking directly at my parents. "I want to remind everyone that we are dealing with potential criminal matters that may be referred to federal prosecutors depending on what evidence is presented today." Frank Morrison, my parents' original attorney, was called as the first witness to explain why he had withdrawn from their case. His testimony was devastating. Under oath, he revealed that my parents had lied to him about the existence of evidence supporting their theft claims, had asked him to present documents they knew were fabricated, and had refused his advice to settle the case when he realized the weakness of their position. "Your Honor," Morrison said, "when I discovered the extent of the counter-evidence being presented by Ms. Mitchell's counsel, I informed my former clients that continuing with their lawsuit could result in criminal charges. They insisted they wanted to proceed anyway, at which point I had no choice but to withdraw." David then systematically presented our evidence, starting with Rebecca's forensic accounting that showed the pattern of theft from my accounts over nearly a decade. The courtroom was silent as he displayed bank records, forged signatures, and documentation of accounts opened in my name without my knowledge. Each piece of evidence was projected on a screen so everyone present could see the scope of my parents' deception. The most dramatic moment came when David played the recorded voicemails my parents had left for me over the past month. As the courtroom listened to my mother's increasingly frantic attempts to convince me to drop the lawsuit, several people in the gallery shook their heads in disbelief. My father's voice, slurred and desperate, could be heard in the background of one message, demanding that my mother make her understand what she's doing to this family. Patricia Walsh attempted to present my parents' defense, but it quickly became clear she was working with fabricated evidence and false statements. When Judge Martinez asked my father directly whether he had opened credit accounts in my name, his answer was a rambling non-denial that only made him look more guilty. My mother's testimony was even worse. She contradicted herself multiple times and became visibly angry when David cross-examined her about the community organization funds she had stolen. The breaking point came when Judge Martinez asked to see the original bank statements my parents claimed proved I had stolen $50,000 from them. After examining the documents with a forensic expert David had brought, she made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. "These documents have been altered," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority. "The account numbers have been changed, dates have been modified, and transaction amounts have been fabricated. This court is looking at evidence of document fraud committed in an attempt to deceive this legal proceeding." My parents' faces went white as Judge Martinez continued. "I am immediately dismissing the plaintiff's lawsuit and referring this matter to federal prosecutors for criminal investigation. This case represents one of the most egregious examples of legal system abuse I have encountered in my career." As the gavel fell, my parents' attorney immediately began damage control conversations with prosecutors who had been observing the proceedings. But it was too late. Their lies had finally caught up with them. What happened next exceeded even David's most optimistic predictions. Within hours of Judge Martinez's ruling, federal prosecutors announced they were opening a full investigation into my parents' activities. The case that had started as a family dispute over a canceled wedding had become a federal criminal matter involving multiple charges of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The local media coverage was relentless. Every detail of my parents' deception was laid bare in newspaper articles and television reports that painted a picture of two people who had spent years systematically destroying their own daughter's financial future. The story resonated with viewers because it touched on every family's worst fears, the people you trust most betraying that trust in the most devastating way possible. But the real devastation came when other victims began coming forward. Amanda's revelation about my mother stealing from community organizations opened a floodgate of investigations that revealed the true scope of their criminal activities. The Historical Society, the Church Building Fund, the local youth sports league, my mother had been stealing from all of them, using her position as a trusted volunteer to embezzle thousands of dollars over several years. Rebecca's continued investigation uncovered even more victims. My parents had been running a sophisticated financial fraud operation that went far beyond their theft from me. They had convinced elderly neighbors to invest money in fake business opportunities, had taken out loans using friends as unknowing co-signers, and had even stolen gift cards and cash from graduation parties and weddings they had attended as guests. The community that had rallied around my parents during their social media campaign was now turning against them with equal fervor. The same people who had posted supportive comments about their betrayal by their ungrateful daughter were now sharing stories about money that had mysteriously gone missing from group events, unexplained charges on shared accounts, and suspicious behavior they had ignored at the time. Mrs. Henderson, the church treasurer who had defended my parents so vigorously on Facebook, discovered that nearly $8,000 had been stolen from the church's emergency fund over 2 years. Mr. Patterson found out that the investment opportunity my father had pitched to him was entirely fabricated, and he had lost his entire retirement savings to their scheme. The Historical Society president realized that the missing fundraiser money my mother had blamed on accounting errors had actually been systematically stolen to fund her lifestyle. Jake's uncle Robert provided the final piece of the puzzle when he came forward with evidence that my parents had been planning their frame job for months. Text messages and emails showed they had been discussing how to make me look guilty of theft while covering up their own financial crimes. They had researched legal strategies, studied other cases of family financial disputes, and carefully planned every aspect of their campaign to destroy my reputation. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Kim, announced that my parents were facing a total of 17 felony charges spanning wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The potential sentence, if convicted on all charges, was over 30 years in federal prison. What had started as their attempt to solve their financial problems by framing me had become a criminal case that could end their lives as free people. The most satisfying moment came when I received a formal apology from the community organizations that had initially supported my parents. The church issued a public statement acknowledging they had been deceived by individuals who exploited their position of trust and expressing support for my decision to pursue justice. The Historical Society president personally called to apologize for believing my parents' lies and to thank me for exposing their theft. But perhaps the most meaningful vindication came from my cousin Jessica, who had questioned my silence months earlier. She called me crying, apologizing not just for doubting me, but for not seeing the signs of my parents' manipulation that she now realized had been obvious all along. "Sarah," she said through tears, "I should have known you would never steal from family. I should have trusted you instead of them. I'm so sorry for what you've been through, and I'm so proud of how you handled this." Standing in my kitchen, looking at the newspaper headlines about my parents' arrest, I finally felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The truth was finally public, and the people who had tried to destroy my life were facing the consequences of their own choices. 3 days after my parents' arrest made national news, I received a phone call that would reveal the most shocking twist in this entire nightmare. The caller was someone I hadn't heard from since the day my wedding was canceled, my wedding planner, Elena Rodriguez. Her voice was shaky as she asked if we could meet privately to discuss something she called crucial information about your parents' case. Elena had been recommended to me by a friend and had seemed like the perfect fit for our wedding. She was professional, organized, and had handled every detail with the kind of precision that made me feel completely confident in her abilities. What I didn't know was that she had been secretly recording conversations with my parents for months, documenting their increasingly erratic behavior and suspicious requests. We met at the same coffee shop where Amanda had revealed my parents' gambling debts, and Elena came prepared with a laptop, recording equipment, and a folder thick with documents. "Sarah, I need you to know that I never intended to get involved in your family's legal troubles," she began. "But after seeing what your parents tried to do to you, I can't stay silent anymore." Elena explained that her wedding planning business was actually a side venture. Her primary career was as a private investigator specializing in corporate fraud cases. She had noticed red flags about my parents' financial situation during our initial meetings and had begun documenting their behavior out of professional instinct rather than any specific suspicion about criminal activity. "Your mother's questions about vendor payments were unusual from the start," Elena said, opening her laptop to show me a series of recorded phone calls. "Most parents want to know about logistics and timing. Your mother was obsessed with how payments were processed, which accounts money came from, and whether there were ways to make it look like certain expenses came from different sources." The recordings Elena played for me were devastating. In conversation after conversation, I heard my mother discussing strategies for making my wedding expenses appear to come from sources other than their actual accounts. She had been planning to use the wedding as cover for moving money between accounts, creating paper trails that would support their eventual theft allegations against me. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Elena had been present during a phone call between my parents and their attorney, Frank Morrison, 3 weeks before the wedding cancellation. She had been at their house finalizing vendor contracts when the call came in, and she had accidentally recorded the entire conversation while testing her equipment for our final planning meeting. "Sarah, your parents weren't just planning to cancel your wedding," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They were planning to frame you for theft from the very beginning. The wedding was never meant to happen. It was all an elaborate setup to create evidence for their lawsuit." The recording she played next made my blood run cold. I heard my father's voice clearly discussing their exit strategy with Morrison, explaining how they would disappear on the wedding morning and leave behind evidence of my supposed financial crimes. My mother could be heard in the background rehearsing the emotional statements she planned to make to family and friends about discovering my betrayal. Most devastating was hearing them discuss their timeline for the social media campaign, the specific language they planned to use in their lawsuit, and their expectations about how much money they could extract from me through their legal threats. They had planned every detail of my public humiliation months in advance, treating the destruction of their own daughter's life as a business transaction. Elena had continued recording even after my wedding was canceled, documenting my parents' increasing desperation as their plan began to unravel. She had evidence of them discussing how to fabricate additional evidence, how to coach witnesses to support their version of events, and most damning of all, their growing awareness that their scheme was falling apart. "The anonymous tip you received from Amanda wasn't random," Elena said. "I had been feeding information to people who could help expose your parents' crimes. I couldn't come forward directly without compromising some of my other cases, but I made sure the right evidence reached the right people." Looking at Elena across that coffee shop table, I realized I had never been fighting this battle alone. While I thought I was maintaining strategic silence and building my case in isolation, someone had been working behind the scenes to ensure justice would be served. 6 months after my parents were arrested, I stood in the bridal suite of the Grandview Country Club, the same venue where my original wedding reception was supposed to have been held. This time, however, I was surrounded by people who truly loved and supported me, preparing for a celebration that represented not just my marriage to Jake, but my triumph over the people who had tried to destroy my life. The settlement from my parents' criminal case had been substantial, over $200,000 in restitution for the money they had stolen from me, plus additional damages for defamation and emotional distress. But more than the financial compensation, I had something far more valuable: complete vindication and the knowledge that justice had been served. My parents were both sentenced to federal prison. My father received 8 years for his role in the conspiracy, while my mother got 6 years and was ordered to pay full restitution to all the community organizations she had robbed. Their house had been seized to pay their debts, their social media accounts had been permanently banned, and their names had become synonymous in our community with betrayal and deception. The guest list for my real wedding was carefully curated. Every person present had either supported me during the darkest months of this ordeal or had genuinely apologized for believing my parents' lies. Notably absent were several extended family members and former friends who had chosen to maintain their loyalty to my parents even after the truth came out. I felt no sadness about their absence. This celebration was for people who understood the difference between truth and manipulation. Elena Rodriguez sat in the front row, having become not just the person who helped expose my parents' crimes, but a genuine friend who understood the complexity of what I had survived. Amanda from the credit union was there with her family, proud that her decision to come forward had helped prevent other families from being destroyed by similar fraud. Even Rebecca Torres, the forensic accountant who had unraveled years of financial deception, had joined us to celebrate what she called the most satisfying case outcome of my career. Jake's family had embraced me completely, but more importantly, they had learned to understand the trauma I had experienced and the strength it had taken to fight back against people who were supposed to protect me. His mother had become my strongest advocate, often telling people that watching me handle this crisis had taught her about resilience and integrity she hadn't known was possible. The most meaningful moment of the day came during the reception when I gave a speech that I had been mentally composing for months. Standing before our guests, I spoke about learning the difference between family and people who happen to be related to you, about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who choose to love you, rather than people who feel obligated to manipulate you. Some of you know that the road to this celebration wasn't easy, I said, looking out at faces that had supported me through the worst period of my life. I learned that when people show you who they really are, believe them the first time, but I also learned that there are people in this world who will stand by you when everyone else walks away, who will help you find the truth when others try to bury it in lies. As Jake and I danced to our first song as a married couple, I caught sight of a newspaper clipping that Rebecca had framed and left on our gift table. The headline read, "Local couple sentenced in elaborate fraud scheme against daughter." Below it, she had written a note, "For Sarah, proof that the truth always wins in the end." Looking around the room at people who had chosen to love and support me, dancing with the man who had never doubted my innocence, I finally understood what victory actually looked like. It wasn't about destroying my parents or getting revenge for their betrayal. It was about building a life surrounded by people who valued honesty, loyalty, and genuine love. My parents had tried to teach me that family meant accepting manipulation and lies for the sake of maintaining relationships. Instead, they had taught me that real family consists of people who fight for you when you can't fight for yourself, who seek truth instead of convenient fiction, and who love you enough to help you become stronger rather than trying to keep you dependent. The girl who had found that devastating note on her wedding morning was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who knew her own worth and would never again allow anyone to diminish it for their own purposes. The final power reversal came 18 months later, when I received a letter from my mother in federal prison. She had written page after page of apologies, claiming she finally understood the damage they had caused and begging for forgiveness. At the bottom, in handwriting that looked frail and desperate, she wrote, "We need you, Sarah. You're the only family we have left." I read that letter sitting in my beautiful new home, surrounded by wedding photos that showed me laughing with people who had chosen to love me unconditionally. Jake was in the kitchen making dinner, humming contentedly as he prepared a meal we would share with friends who had become our chosen family. The woman who had once manipulated me by claiming I owed her loyalty because she was my mother was now begging for mine because she had no one else. The daughter she had tried to control through financial dependence now controlled her ability to maintain any family connection at all. I folded the letter carefully, walked to my shredder, and watched it disappear into thin strips. Some bridges, once burned, should stay that way. Thanks for spending time with this story. If it resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Someone else may need to hear it too. Watch another real-life journey by clicking on the left and subscribe so you never miss what comes next.